Okay, so again, welcome everyone to today's online seminar. And the topic of today's conversation is early detection in dementia and all the issues, conceptual issues, practical issues surrounding that. I'm very honored to be your host for what I think is going to be a really enlightening, engaging event. Our focus today are the critical issues surrounding dementia diagnosis, trying to look at this from different perspectives and trying to acknowledge all the difficulties and the complexities associated with this. As we all know, dementia is a growing concern worldwide. It affects not only those diagnosed, but also their families, communities, and puts pressure on the healthcare systems. Understanding the early detection and diagnosis is crucial for developing effective interventions and also support system. So in light of this growing realization that urgent action is needed to mitigate the burden of Alzheimer's disease, there has been a significant shift toward identifying individuals much earlier in the disease process. So the aim of this seminar is to contribute to this crucial conversation, offering insights on early detection from different perspectives. So we will begin the seminar with a presentation from Dr. Richard Milne, titled Defining Dementia Detection, Diagnosis, and Screening. If there's something wrong in the title, you can correct it in the presentation. Dr. Milne, well, thanks for accepting the invitation, for being here. Dr. Milne serves as the Deputy Director of the Kavli Centre for Ethics, Science, and the Public at Cambridge University, and he's also Head of Research and Dialogue at Wellcome Connecting Science. His extensive research explores the relationship between science and the public, particularly in the context of emerging social and ethical challenges brought about by scientific advancement. Today, Dr. Milne will share his insights into the evolving definitions and approaches to diagnosing Alzheimer's disease, something that is critically important for the field of dementia research. After Dr. Milne's presentation, we will have a 5-minute break. This break is especially designed for our captioning services, but I think it's also helpful for all of us. And then at 3:30, we will reconvene for our second presentation titled Meanings and Uncertainty in Diagnosing Dementias by Dr. Julia Swallow and Dr. Alexandra Hillman. Dr. Hillman is an associate professor in sociology at the Wellcome Trust Centre for Cultures and Environments of Health. She focused her research on the care of older people and the ethical aspects of living well with dementia. Dr. Swallow is a Wellcome Trust Senior Research Fellow at the Centre for Biomedicine, Self and Society at Edinburgh University, and she brings her expertise in science and technology studies and medical sociology to explore the boundaries between normal aging and pathological cognitive deterioration. Together, they will shed light on the uncertainties and meanings that pervade the diagnosis of dementia, also contributing to a broader understanding of this complex condition. Finally, after the 3 presentations, we will have a Q&A session that I will moderate. So welcome, Dr. Richard Milne. We'll start with your presentation.
Thanks very much, Chris, for the introduction. And thanks so much, Alex, for the invitation as well. It's really, yeah, I'm just going to try and get my screen sharing, which worked before, so it might well work again. There we go. Yeah, so thanks for the invitation. And as I was saying, as we were kind of like doing the technical setup and things, this is the work that I'm going to talk about is a kind of paper that I've been trying to get together for quite a while now, and I'm still not quite sure it's there. So I'm very open to helpful suggestions and feedback. Right, but what I'm drawing on is a series of studies. So I've been kind of involved in work around changing definitions and approaches to Alzheimer's disease for quite a while, initially through a series of projects funded by the Innovative Medicines Initiative, which were kind of broad European platforms around clinical trials development. and then through kind of Wellcome Trust studies of new tools for early detection. And broadly, these kind of been focused on these translational efforts associated with changing approaches to the definition, detection, and diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. And what I'm going to do in the next 20 minutes, and I will try and get through in a timely manner, is to kind of give a bit of background to the changing nature of Alzheimer's disease as a condition that, for somebody with a kind of background in science and technology studies and sociology of science, is one of the most kind of fascinating areas of scientific work, I think, within medicine. And the kind of the narrative of how Alzheimer's disease as the main cause of dementia has undergone these kind of definitional shifts over the last 10 to 15 years, and this kind of move to early detection. And then I'm going to talk about early detection and a word that I think, Chris, you didn't mention so much in your introduction, but which is kind of and I think that's not atypical, this kind of question of screening. And I just basically have this kind of personal question of like, of where is screening in all of these conversations about early detection and early diagnosis. And so this paper is partly a quest to kind of to find screening and to understand whether we need the concept of screening in this case. And I'm going to do that through talking about work that we've done over the last couple of years around digital tools for the early detection of cognitive decline associated with Alzheimer's disease. And then finally, this kind of idea of incidental screening. Right. So as I said, Alzheimer's disease is the main cause of dementia, the main single cause of dementia. And basically around the kind of end of the 2000s and into the early 2010s, there was this kind of process of scientific efforts to redefine what counted as Alzheimer's disease, and to open up the continuum of from the earliest biological changes associated with disease through to later symptomatic stages. And the most influential of those definitions was the one proposed by the National Institutes of Aging and the Alzheimer's Association in the United States in 2011, which separated AD dementia, Alzheimer's disease dementia, from kind of prodromal disease, and then kind of introduced this category of preclinical Alzheimer's disease as kind of the presence of biological changes but without symptoms. And this kind of trajectory that they proposed is defined by changes in molecular biomarkers, and it's a story that in many ways is familiar from work around molecularization more broadly, about the ways in which biological changes come to define this kind of continuum from health to illness associated with different levels of markers of disease that position you on that continuum. Kind of technically, the ones that were used were AT and N, so markers of amyloid, of another protein called tau, and of neurodegenerative changes. And then in the most recent definitions proposed last year, that's been narrowed down to amyloid and tau specifically as the two kind of markers of biological change through which the disease is identified. And in the first two iterations of this preclinical category was clearly defined as for research use only. And then in 2023, the revised framework proposed a major new direction, which was to expand the 2018 framework from a research-only focus to one that provides diagnostic and staging criteria to inform both research and clinical care. So it was kind of suggesting that in this definition that this preclinical category might no longer only be a research one, but that it might kind of the kind of door might be opening to clinical implementation. And in part, that was a response to the dramatic things that have been happening around approvals of new drugs in the United States, particularly over the last couple of years, where after a kind of 20-year period of repeatedly unsuccessful clinical trials, the first couple of drugs have been approved. And there's a huge amount of controversy around those and lots of questions. And I'm more than happy to talk about that, but I'm not going to kind of touch on it in detail. And over this time, this kind of move of changing diagnosis, changing diagnostic criteria, there's been a kind of this contestation about what are the consequences of these molecularized imaginaries of precision medicine, and this idea that, as Margaret Lock put it, that embodied risk is manifest in the form of biomarkers, and what does that do to how we understand this kind of complex condition associated with aging, and more than simply the biological. So that's the kind of question about what are we doing to this complex social disease as we molecularize it, and then a second set of considerations about what happens as we move from that molecularized version of disease back into practice. So long-term concerns about what happens in terms of the use of risk information to tell people if people are told that they have preclinical Alzheimer's disease or at a high risk. And it's a kind of repeated trope of media reporting around Alzheimer's, particularly on the one hand, you have the story about the potential therapies that are coming down the line, the potential diagnostics that are coming down the line, and then you have, on the other hand, the would you want to know? And we've seen that over the last few weeks, actually, in terms of blood tests around Alzheimer's disease. And in, I think, places like the Times and the Daily Mail, quotes there about, would you want to know? What would it mean to know? But also questions about, if we move towards this large-scale population implementation of molecularized definitions of Alzheimer's disease, what happens in terms of considerations about overtreatment, overdiagnosis? And there's in the kind of recent conversations, one of the most striking examples of this was the response of the American Geriatric Society, which is a professional body for geriatricians in the United States. In their response to the consultation on the proposed NIA-AA criteria in 2023, that basically in response to this idea that this door to kind of clinical implementation might be opening, they said that they were concerned that it would place many older and multimorbid people at risk of overdiagnosis and overtreatment, and that there could be unintended harms. And their response to it, their response to this consultation actually led to the National Institute of Aging taking their name off the criteria, which are now simply the Alzheimer's Association criteria for Alzheimer's disease, as opposed to the NIA ones. And so these kind of, so concerns about what happens to the health system as a whole and to the individuals that it's treating as you move into these kind of this early detection focused context. Which for me is a kind of gateway into a conversation about screening. So this, as a kind of background, this idea that screening is the process of the UK's National Screening Committee puts it, the process of identifying healthy people who may have an increased chance of having a disease or condition, enabling earlier treatment. And screening is associated with a kind of clear frameworks of governance and public health ethics that are often different from those that are maybe applied in a kind of clinical implementation context, but have this kind of long history that's kind of generally grounded in the report by Wilson and Youngner for the World Health Organization in the late 60s. And what we know about screening programs is that for those who are targeted by them, they create these kind of normative expectations about what's the sensible and responsible course of action if you're presented with a test. The possibility of a test is like the idea of there being a moral obligation. From the work of Timmermans and Bookbinder on genetic screening, we know that that screening programs similarly to kind of clinical uses of disease categories play this ontological role in defining disease, in which kind of any prior understanding that we have of disease is inevitably found to be insufficient once you implement a population screening program, particularly in terms of understanding the kind of the course of disease trajectory. And that screening is perhaps the kind of technique par excellence of David Armstrong's description of surveillance medicine. This idea of a type of medicine that moves outside the clinic into these new spaces of illness, such as the community and home, adds this extra temporal dimension through which illness is constituted as this state or point of perpetual becoming, and that screening involves this monitoring of this precarious normality. This idea that the current states are prone to change. And screening has been, over the last decade or more, a real point of contest in conversations around dementia and Alzheimer's. So back in 2012, the Dementia Sequin in the UK recommended the asking of the question, have a single screening question, have you been more forgetful in the last 12 months to the extent that it significantly affected your life? In 2014, GPs it was proposed that GPs would give middle-aged people brain tests for dementia, and alongside that, this reimbursement process that was the idea that GPs were being paid to find cases of dementia among people who are coming in for other problems. And it just as a note, I think that what that case shows as well is that when we think about screening, often screening and population screening are taken to be synonymous. So whether that's a the idea that screening happens as a large scale program that's rolled out to people get sent letters, but also it includes things like case finding, like opportunistic screening, essentially this testing of people who aren't necessarily aware that they have an issue, and then referring them on for further diagnosis. Alongside this this constant nudge of policy efforts to can we do some kind of screening? Is some kind of screening feasible? You've had the repeated reviews of evidence from the Canadian Task Force on Preventative Healthcare, from the UK National Screening Committee, from the US Prevention Task Force, all of whom have recommended against screening. In general, because of the lack of evidence about its effectiveness, but also because of concerns about the potential harms of informing people that they're at risk, or they have signs of Alzheimer's disease or dementia that they weren't previously aware of. And this debate around screening has obviously, in the last couple of weeks, as long after I'd agreed to come and talk, suddenly things about screening started popping up everywhere, associated with the development of blood-based biomarkers. So generally, biomarkers of Alzheimer's disease have been taken either by PET brain imaging or through spinal fluid. And this idea that we might be close to a blood test that could replace those has been circulating in the last couple of weeks. And alongside that, a push from researchers who have been heavily involved in clinical trials and drug development in the United States for a screening program to support the implementation of the rollout of those drugs as and when they come, because those new medicines, lecanemab and aducanumab, donanemab, it's got too many N's for me to deal with in the name, but they're all tied to the use of biomarkers to identify people who would be suitable for treatment. So the question, so the question that I want to come back to then is this idea that screening is constantly part of this conversation around dementia, and I was interested in what's the role that it plays in terms of in the imaginaries and the practices and the justifications that people give as they're developing early detection tools. And so this was a focus of a project that I ran with my colleague Alessia Costa for over a couple of years, looking at the development of digital tools for early detection. So there's a huge amount of excitement around dementia and around mental health more generally, around the ability of things like wearables, smartwatches, smartphones, smart speakers, anything that's smart, but also things like GPS data from cars and things to be able to infer information about an individual's cognitive health. And so this is a kind of, a review from 2019, kind of picking out all of these kind of sensors and things that might possibly give information that could be used in early detection of dementia. But it's not a new idea. I mean, if you go back to the 1980s, so the Office for Technology Assessment in the US published a report in 1985 called Technology and Aging in America, about the kind of this long-term vision of the development of smart sensors, personal home health monitoring systems, these systems that were going to be integrated into our lives in ways that they would detect and monitor changes in measurements related to our health. And then in the 1990s, you had things like this wonderful house, which is the smart home in Georgia, that was developed by Georgia Tech University, which over the last kind of 25 years has been kitted out with all kinds of things to basically test students as they sleep and move around, and to see what can be inferred about their cognition. So it's a long-term project of this kind of embedding of sensors and detection, but it's something that's really kind of obviously taken off as alongside the kind of increasing digitization of everyday life. And broadly, as we kind of looked at these tools, there were three kind of things that people were doing. So the first was taking something like a kind of mini mental state exam or Montreal cognitive assessment and just putting it on a tablet or something, so that it was kind of, it's basically the same test, but it's on a tablet rather than paper, and it's kind of so it's makes data collection easier. Things like the kind of clock drawing test. Then the second was about asking people to take take assessments that required them to actively engage, but with things that you couldn't do on paper. So so that might involve, the one at the bottom left here is a kind of augmented reality, like hiding something in a room, and where you can kind of see it. You can only see it with the tablet, and then it disappears, and you have to remember where it was. So it's kind of digital, but an active engagement. And then the final category is the use of kind of background data. In work on surveillance capitalism has been called kind of the data exhaust. This idea that we're all generating this stream of data about ourselves, and that's become a kind of key source of value for data companies, for tech companies, and that is kind of colonizing more and more parts of our lives. And so you can see this in, well, that's the wrong way. A couple of examples of this kind of what is a kind of coming together of Armstrong's ideas around surveillance medicine with these ideas around surveillance capitalism, through the involvement of companies like Apple, through the kind of which is conducting a clinical trial with Biogen on the development of kind of Apple Watch based tools for monitoring brain health, or in the patent for the Google Home smart speaker, which includes this idea that the Google Home system may monitor household occupants' movement patterns, compare these with patterns associated with Alzheimer's disease, and infer the probability that the household occupant has the disease, and that this may then be reported on. So there's a kind of sense in which this testing, kind of background testing, has a value for kind of over and beyond its potential kind of public health impact. Oops, what's going on? So we went around and interviewed about 25 people who were involved in developing these technologies, who emphasized things like the fact that it's that these tests are portable. People can do it at home. They can. It's real world. It's accurate. It's outside, and it's outside the clinic. It's longitudinal, kind of capturing some of those qualities that I think you might kind of suggest for those of screening. The kind of the questions of where it happens, the temporal aspects, the kind of the ease with which things were doing, the link to things like individual health improvement. So in the last kind of minute or so that I'll talk about this, I'll try, so because this then raised the question of, so if we've got these characteristics, which to me, I mean, these kind of questions of scale and scale and temporality, and the kind of sites at which testings occurred, seem to me to kind of have a lot in common with screening, which again kind of came to my question of like, well, why aren't we talking about screening in this context? And some people are. So when we ask people kind of what kind of tool is this, you know, there's an extent to which for some of the people who are talking to us from companies, they do clearly see these devices as screening tools. They are a way into healthcare systems, or that, you know, so that it'll be a sorting, an appropriate call to action for the individual, which could be to take action, or a signal for a connected system to take action, and that could be the national healthcare system or the GP or the family or whatever. That there's a kind of screening onwards. It's not necessarily clear how that's integrated into, you know, it's a signal to somebody in the same way as the Google Home speaker. It passes on a signal. It's not quite clear who that signal, to whom that signal goes, but it is there. But there was also a lot of conversation. We had lots of conversations about, well, this isn't really screening. So, which sometimes went a bit like this, about this kind of thing, like, well, it would be screening if the health system was doing it, if it was the NHS that was asking you to do this. But if it's just me testing myself, or it's my insurance company, then it's not screening. It's just, you know, keeping track of my health. And if, you know, if it tells me that I've got a problem and I do something about that, that's not screening. And I don't think this is particularly unusual in the kind of digital health space, in a sense that we have these this gap, I think, opening up between kind of things that happen within the health system, things that are for personal interest, and then the things that allow the kind of bridging and between those. And what was clear in some of the interviews was that this isn't an incidental gap. You know, that there is a clear value to keeping that distance and that gap in place. So just taking the second one of these. So I was talking to a CEO of a digital health company, developing a cognitive assessment, who said, we have a product which is a medical product, which is for all the regulators and has its intended use, and that's to be used by clinicians in the clinic. And then we have the health product on the other side. And so we don't tell anyone there if they have a problem. We just tell you that you're doing better or worse compared to yourself. So it's not, it's individualized rather than population level. And so that even if you have a medical condition, if you use that, you're still a user, you're not a patient. And so there's a kind of clear distinction in these interviews, and in the one above, that these are separate spaces. So in the one above, you've got diagnosis on one hand, and you've got a consumer business on the one hand, on the other, and that has important implications in regulatory terms. Finally, though, where this becomes really interesting is the nature of these tests. So this wonderfully complicated picture is from the dementia platform EasyIt, which has been rolled out in Southeast Asia by the pharmaceutical company Eisai. And it splits, again, like as in the interviews, into a kind of daily living domain and a medical domain. And within the medical domain, you have this test, Cognigram, which is a HIPAA-compliant Class 2 medical device that assesses cognition as part of a clinical workup. On the other side, you have Nuno, which is a consumer test of your brain health. And the challenge in kind of maintaining this distance is that essentially the Cogstate brief battery that's described here is essentially the same test in both sides. And it goes through the same kind of data analytics process. So I think what you end up with is this kind of challenge of keeping the same thing in two different places based on a kind of essentially having efforts to draw a line between a clinical space and a consumer space, and which is creating, I think, a gap into which kind of population health conversations are falling. And I will stop there, just with kind of some kind of concluding thoughts, which is that this large-scale testing of cognitively healthy individuals looks very much to me like screening, at least, and fits with the changing nature of screening as a whole, which has become more local, less formal, more penetrating, and less resistible in Armstrong's terms. But whenever we have conversations around digital health, this conversation about screening is generally missing. We talk about detection and diagnosis, or we talk about detection and consumer lifestyle changes. We don't talk about screening, which means that we don't talk about the frameworks and governance questions that we ask about screening. We don't talk about the kind of moral frameworks of responsibility and obligations that come with screening. And we don't talk about the relationship between kind of state-led population health and the socio-political questions associated with kind of ownership, legitimacy, authority, who delivers ownership and access, these things. And then finally, although there is an element, I think, to which there's a kind of deliberate separation, there's also a question about how the emergence of these types of tools is happening incidentally, in a sense that they are tools that are being adopted for individual health, but are in the process creating an infrastructure of population health that doesn't have the ability to be captured by kind of top-down population health governance. So I'll stop there, and thank you for listening, and I look forward to kind of having a chat later.
Thank you, Richard. That was great, and lots of things to discuss. As I said at the beginning, we will now have a small 5-minute break, and then we will come back with Alex's and Julia's presentation. So 3:39, I think. 3:39. Okay, so welcome back, everyone. We will start now. So please, Alex and Julia, you can share the screen.
Thank you, Chris. I will share the screen, hopefully. Has that worked okay? Yeah, great. Okay, thanks, Chris. Shall I just get going then? Yeah, great. Okay. Hi everyone. So the focus of our presentation then today is moving into the clinical space. So it's on diagnosis in clinical practice. In particular, how uncertainty around a diagnosis of Alzheimer's, which we suggest relates both to the difficulty in categorising the condition, as well as its associated feelings of fear and anxiety, are dealt with in clinical practice, with a focus both on the tools used to detect initial cognitive decline and the act of diagnosis itself. And it's based on a paper that Alex and I co-wrote together in Social Studies of Science, and we've included a reference to this at the end. So to give you a bit of background then on the UK context of dementia diagnosis in the clinic, efforts to improve the detection of Alzheimer's and increase diagnosis rates drives UK healthcare policy initiatives. It's a policy priority where provision of memory clinics has grown, and these have been identified by the government as the best service through which to carry out assessments and reach a diagnosis of dementia. As a result, there's been a steady increase in the number of referrals made to memory clinics, as well as an overall increase in diagnosis rates. And alongside this policy commitment, and as we've heard from Richard, dementia-related scientific research focuses on early detection, the continuous redefining of Alzheimer's. And this biological is widely successful in attracting research funding, where delaying, slowing down and warding off loss of cognition is a powerful discourse which drives biotechnological development. So as a result of both this policy and scientific research, care with kind of respect to non-biomedical intervention in healthcare practice as an alternative for managing Alzheimer's has been relatively overlooked. It reflects a reorientation away from post-diagnostic support in preference of diagnosis of new patients. And the NHS in recent years has faced and continues to face huge financial cuts, with the majority of NHS trusts experiencing rising debt. And social care in the UK has also seen a marked decline in terms of funding. So that's kind of the context of where we are in the UK. So drawing on data then from 2 ethnographic studies of memory clinics in the UK, we'll focus on how uncertainty, which is related both to difficulties in categorising the condition, as well as the fear and anxiety associated with the condition, is negotiated and resolved in the process of diagnosis. So I'll give a really brief overview of the studies on which this presentation is grounded. So Alex and I conducted 2 separate ethnographies of memory clinics. Alex's research was funded by a Wellcome Trust Fellowship Award, and my PhD research was funded by an ESRC Doctoral Studentship Award. Alex carried out her study in 1 memory clinic in Wales and 1 in the southwest, and both of mine were conducted in Yorkshire. And observations were carried out across each of the studies, including in multidisciplinary team meetings and clinical consultations. And interviews were carried out with clinic staff both in psychiatry and psychology, and with patients and relatives. In terms of the makeup, why can't I move my screen? Sorry about this. There we go. Yes, so in terms of the makeup of the clinics then, so all clinics kind of functioned in similar ways, assessing patients experiencing problems with thinking and memory. The disciplinary background of memory staff kind of varied from clinic to clinic. Some are run from within old age psychiatry services, others are led by consultant geriatricians within memory clinics, and although less common in the UK, some form part of the neurology services. And all memory services form part of secondary healthcare. Patients mainly attend memory clinics through referral from their general practitioner, but they can also be made via community and other secondary services or self-referral. And following referral, patients have an initial assessment, which involves the use of cognitive tests, gathering patient history, clinical tests, including blood tests, a heart trace, increasingly a CT scan of the brain. And these are used primarily to rule out the possibility of other conditions. It's primarily a diagnosis by exclusion. And the cognitive testing makes up, at the most, 25 minutes of the clinical encounter. And these can include Montreal Cognitive Assessment, the Mini Mental State Examination, and the Addenbrooke's Cognitive Examination. And these tend to be administered by memory nurses or student psychologists, with the evaluation of tests and the consultations carried out by psychiatrists, geriatricians, and sometimes psychologists. Okay, so to give you a sense of what we mean in terms of this idea of uncertainty and how it relates to this idea of emotions as well as care. Diagnosing Alzheimer's in the clinic is a really complex process, which is marked by uncertainty. It remains a diagnosis by exclusion, as I've said, and can't be definitively diagnosed until post-mortem examination. So its etiology remains uncertain. And symptoms associated with cognitive decline are also really difficult to separate from those of normal ageing processes. Uncertainties which are compounded by the difficulty distinguishing between diseases within the broader all-encompassing condition of dementia. It's also highly stigmatised and feared, perceived and portrayed primarily as a process of loss of self to the horrors of Alzheimer's. It's often metaphorically conceived as a fate worse than death, sometimes even as a living death, because of its association with a gradual decline of independence and agency, which results in what's been termed as a complete loss of self. And these pervasive images of what it means to be diagnosed have a direct impact on the clinical consultation and how diagnosis is approached and managed. So with all this in mind then, to give a brief overview of our theoretical positioning, we frame our analysis within science and technology studies and medical sociological work on care and the role of affect in the production of scientific and clinical work. At the same time, we're interested in the role of uncertainty as a valuable resource for the production of clinical knowledge. And we show the various forms of care work that are performed in the clinic to account for and manage affective relations and uncertainty. And this is about illustrating the important relationship between these affective economies, to draw on the work of Sarah Ahmed, and the uncertainties and ambiguities that pervade dementia diagnosis and assessment. So whilst fear and anxiety of dementia have stuck, to draw on Ahmed, who suggests that emotions do things and are passed through into the clinic through care work, including the tinkering of technologies, such as cognitive screening tools, as well as the slowing down of the diagnosis process, clinicians are able to utilise rather than dispose of fear and anxiety. And really importantly, uncertainty is utilised rather than closed down. And feelings of fear and anxiety associated with dementia not only shape people's experiences and responses to diagnosis, but also shape the practice and processes through which assessments and diagnoses are accomplished. So how do clinicians respond to and navigate and negotiate these uncertainties and affects and emotions in the clinic and work towards diagnosis? So firstly then, I will focus on the role of cognitive screening tests. To deal with feelings of fear and anxiety, practitioners engaged in what we describe, to build on the work of Anne-Marie Moll, are tinkering practices. They carefully choreograph the consultation process, taking care of the vulnerabilities of the diagnostic encounter. And this happened in various ways and across consultations, through the kind of practical recrafting of cognitive screening tools. So for example, missing questions on the test, changing the order of the tests and test questions, actively missing out sections. So the tools became kind of inscribed with these ad hoc procedures to transform and make sense of complexity. So the tools could be employed as a means of protecting patients from the vulnerabilities of the encounter. As this memory nurse explains, you know, it's not a threatening thing, you know, at the end of this test, you're not going to say, oh, well, right, because of this test, you've got Alzheimer's. You can't do that. It's about making them feel, I'll have a go at doing this, you know, I'm not under pressure, it doesn't matter. And I won't say, oh, you've got that wrong, you know, they just literally go through it bit by bit. And then afterwards, I always say, well done, whatever they've done, you know, this is lovely now, thank you. So through these kinds of reassurance practices of clinicians then, the tools are kind of mediated to negotiate the emotions which circulate in the clinic, to account for and make sense of fear and anxiety. And we witness these kinds of reassurance practices across most consultations. Practitioners kind of continually encourage patients, stopping to say, well done, telling them to just do their best, and they kind of producing moments of care through which the tools were performed and ascribed meaning. And this is important in so much as these practices don't render the tools useless or devalued. They're crucial for making sense of uncertainty and for negotiating the emotions which pass through into the clinic. Alongside the kind of tinkering of technologies then, the pacing of a dementia diagnosis further utilises uncertainty. I spoke to a trainee psychiatrist who emphasised the impact a diagnosis can have on patients and their families, and explained how extending diagnosis into the future, or timing it right, has the potential to mediate some of their emotional distress, as she explained. So not everybody wants a diagnosis. I had a case recently, a still ongoing case, of a gentleman in his early 70s who used to be very high functioning. I've given them a diagnosis of dementia, and him and his wife are just devastated. You know, they wanted this diagnosis, but then they go home and they sit and, you know, they're devastated by it. And you wonder, actually, maybe in a kind of couple of years of not knowing that he definitely had dementia, it might have been good for them because he's so frustrated and worried about the future. So the psychiatrist reflects on the potential for diagnosis to create anxiety for both patients and their families. Whilst a diagnosis might be helpful for individuals, it doesn't necessarily ease their anxieties or low expectations concerning the future. And handling this information about diagnosis is seen to require care, given that the anticipation associated with it has important at times adverse implications for both patients and their families. So perhaps, as trainee psychiatrist suggests, time and extending diagnosis into the future or slowing down a diagnosis might protect patients or mediate their anxieties about the future. And clinicians can also allow for moments of uncertainty to linger, again, often as a response to a perceived risk of emotional distress. And this following extract comes from an interview with one of the doctors working in the memory service, where she describes a common approach to the mediation of fears and anxieties in the context of diagnosis. The problem, you know, unfortunately, we don't have an easy test that you can say you are definitely on the early stages of Alzheimer's. Sometimes it's a matter of seeing you over a period of time and seeing how things go, and then we'll have more of an idea. So once again, then we see the kind of uncertainties and challenges of reaching a definitive diagnosis of Alzheimer's and other causes of dementia highlighted at the outset. Even at the point of attaching a clinical label, many doctors describe it as a working diagnosis, something that's always in process, being reassessed and worked at. And time is described by the doctor here as a means through which to get a better sense of what the cause of the problem might be. And time and kind of slowing down the pace of diagnosis, as well as the slowing down and spreading out of the disease, was a central kind of way through which clinicians are able to mediate feelings of fear or worry in the everyday encounters in the memory clinic. And this extension of time then, opening out processes for assessment and reassessment and extending the meanings of the diagnosis, might represent a good example of Puig de la Bellacasa's care time, which suspends the future and distends the present, thickening it with a myriad of demanding attachments. I'll pass over to you, Alex.
Thanks, Julia. So just continuing from where Julia left off, it's not just the pacing of diagnosis. I think time and temporality, or temporal registers more generally, play a really useful role in clinical context to navigate affective relations, difficult emotions that come into the clinic that surround disease and illness. And there's a great deal of uncertainty around the diagnosis of Alzheimer's and other causes of dementia that isn't just about the diagnosis itself. I was thinking there about Richard saying about people at risk of being on this kind of perpetual state of being. But even after the diagnosis, there's a great deal of uncertainty about the speed with which people's conditions may progress, the nature with which people will experience symptoms, the kinds of symptoms they will experience is all extremely uncertain. Everybody's experience is different. So that uncertainty really pervades so much of the consultations that happen in memory clinics around diagnosing and assessing people with possible dementias. And so it can move people across these different temporal registers between their experiences of the past, how they are feeling about the present and what that might mean for their futures. And of course, the futures are constituted according to those different meanings we attach to dementia, or what a good dementia or good Alzheimer's experience might look like in the future. And we hear a lot about kind of continuity, holding on to remaining capacities, people's capacity to live independently, for example, but those things can often shift. And one of the things that's clear from our research that we'll probably come back to later and towards the end of the presentation is that the efforts to some extent to shift that object of fear into the future, that sort of figure of dementia, of loss around a kind of this narrative of a living death, can actually work to intensify those fears and anxieties in the present, that they kind of become embodied alongside a living present. And that's something that we'll return to in other examples. So in the next extract I want to show in the next slide, Julia, we're doing a bit of a double act, so I might have to intervene with slide changes. Sorry, Julia. Is about how those temporal registers might be used. So this idea of being in a state of living in prognosis, so about the meanings attached to your diagnosis and what that might mean for your future, and the ways in which clinicians use those different temporal registers to try and navigate some of those affective relations and emotional distress. And one of the ways through this extract was drawing on that temporal framing of the kind of the slow nature of Alzheimer's progression, in an effort to try and counter those feelings of fear. So the clinician in this extract describes that the Alzheimer's disease has got this reputation of being this awful condition, and they even talk about the comparison it's made of being somehow worse than cancer. And they explain that they're not quite sure why it's earned this position, and they kind of explain this by saying that actually it develops really slowly, that it's likely to be less of a problem for the patient themselves, perhaps more for their families. And they say there's no reason for me to think you're suddenly going to lose your mind in the next couple of weeks, months, years. You know, even in a year's time, I'm not expecting you to be very much different from today. So let's keep things in proportion. Okay, so if we move on to the next slide, we've seen from Julia's part of the presentation how those practices of tinkering that she explained and the pacing of a diagnosis, those practices where you're utilising uncertainty, can allow practitioners to really take care of some of those vulnerabilities related to people's fears and anxieties. And that can also open out spaces where clinicians can respond to the specific circumstances and contexts of individuals and families. But one of the things we really wanted to understand was, given all of this uncertainty and ambiguity and the presence of these kind of circulating affective relations, how do clinicians actually make good decisions? How do they make decisions about the potential causes of people's problems that people can feel confident about, that they can actually reach some kind of resolution, if you like? And in attending to this question, we did see how some utility of uncertainty and ambiguity was used through a different set of mechanisms that actually sought to some extent traverse or defer or displace those affective relations, those emotions. And this goes back to some extent to some quite early work in medical sociology around clinical disposals, which is to show how things like the routinization and standardization of clinical work and the organization of clinical work plays a pivotal role in being able to reach authoritative answers to clinical problems. And we saw that very much through the kind of pragmatic and practical strategies that clinicians employed to try and reach some kind of explanation, if you like, for the problems patients attended with. And routinization was a really important part of this, even to the point of communicating a diagnosis. So we have one example from a clinician who described the ways in which they drew on kind of a set of standardized phrases, or even kind of a blurb that they would kind of repeat to patients that helped them to be able to frame the potential problems they were facing in particular ways that could try and help manage any strong emotional responses. So one of them describes this as saying, I guess you have stock phrases. And I'm sure the psychologists sitting in with me are fed up of hearing, but stock phrases like, and then they give an account of their particular kind of blurb or setup. They say, I guess my job here is to put the pieces of the puzzle together, and we're drawing on tests and scans. There's not one thing telling me this, but that you may be right to have these concerns because I'm worried there's something serious going on. And then they end by asking, have you had any thoughts of what this could be? And we saw this quite a lot in the consultations we observed about asking that question. And I think that was in part testing the waters about what the expectations were about what might be causing these problems, but also the degree of readiness to hearing certain diagnoses and what the reactions might be. But more generally, drawing on those everyday routines of clinical work was really a way of kind of maintaining the definition of the situation, if you want to use a sort of Goffman term to describe it, but a way of kind of drawing on that routinization and standardization to really help set the conditions or the expectations of what an appropriate response might be to given diagnoses. And we saw this really interestingly in the account by one of the memory nurses who was describing the different reaction that individuals and families had to a diagnosis when they received it at home, as opposed to in the clinic. And she describes a memory of this where she had been given where a couple had been given the diagnosis at home, and she describes them being in floods of tears and suggests that that probably wouldn't have been able to happen in the clinical context. But she says she thinks this is a good thing, because that was a natural reaction. But I think what this tells us is that those outward reactions or emotional responses may be less of a reflection of that emotional response, but actually a reflection of that socio-material environment of the clinic and the kind of meanings attached to settings and situations that can some extent define what is or isn't an appropriate response. And then building on that idea of the ways in which some aspects or mechanisms or strategies within the clinic were there to kind of necessarily work through, navigate and manage those emotional responses, uncertainty itself became quite often a mechanism through which to do this, to try and kind of traverse or contain those affective relations. And one instance was by trying to kind of open up or challenge the labels themselves. So this doctor says, and this is to the daughter of a patient who'd attended, who was in another room at this stage having undergoing a cognitive test. And the doctor explains to the daughter that I think just as far as labels are concerned, he was saying, was it dementia, was it this or the other? And she kind of says there are bits of the brain that aren't working properly, and dementia just means loss of mental abilities. And on that basis, she's got some loss. So definitely she's got some form of dementia. The problem is immediately you say dementia and they interpret it differently, assume it's inevitably progressive and that people go gaga when their memory's a problem. Well, actually, it's just because conditions like Alzheimer's disease probably typically cause memory problems. So yes, she has some cause of dementia, but probably it's not a particularly helpful word to use because it pushes the wrong buttons. So in this case, it's the labels that are kind of challenged and opened up, and there's an attempt to kind of attend directly to those feelings of fear and anxiety embodied in that figure of dementia, this idea of going gaga, or that kind of reference, I guess, to a narrative of senility, in a bid to try and displace or contain its effect. And we see that emotions in the context of the memory clinic, as Julia's kind of set out, are aligned to those wider socio-historical connections or conceptions of dementia as signifying this progressive loss of self and that stigmatization of things like the associations with madness and senility. But in this case, the doctor's response attends to kind of two specific types of fear. And the first is kind of the present temporal register, which is that what this deterioration in the mother's speech might actually mean, but also that anticipated fear produced through these circulating meanings of dementia as a signifier of loss and decline. What does this mean for the future? But the deferring or obscuring of the fears associated with dementia and Alzheimer's was also accomplished to some extent by an eradication of categories or labels, and instead speaking about specific changes that are happening inside the brain and making less of a connection, if you like, to diagnostic labels. So in this case, the doctor describes how the brain isn't working properly in a particular area, and that these brain cells are gradually not working. He describes it's a little like people who develop Alzheimer's disease, because Alzheimer's disease, it's the memory part of the brain that doesn't work. And in your case, it's the talking part of the brain. So it's not anything to worry about or be concerned about particularly. And the patient responds saying, that's easy for you to say. So in this case, the doctor explains that it's a bit like Alzheimer's disease, but it's focusing much more on the specificity of the changes happening in the brain. But the extent to which this is successful in displacing feelings of fear and anxiety is less certain. The patient themselves describes, well, that's easy for you to say, which suggests that it remains to be a worry for them. But that attempt to defer feelings of fear and anxiety by removing labels or disassociating with those stigmatizing associations can actually result in an intensification of feelings of fear and anxiety. Ahmed's work in particular suggests that those anticipated futures, like the figure of a living death, of living with dementia, can actually circulate and accumulate affective value. So feelings can intensify precisely because there's no fixed reference. So it's being disassociated with an object in the present. It's this idea, to go back again to the idea of the future figure becomes embodied in the living present. So just to finish, I guess with the two sort of central themes really, that one is that I guess our work is trying to draw out how that ambivalence and those uncertainties can actually have a great deal of utility in navigating and negotiating those affective relations that can surround difficult conditions like Alzheimer's and dementia. But also that there's this duality, that on the one hand, it can hold real opportunities for some of that care work of opening out opportunities to attend to those vulnerabilities and those emotions, or to really extend moments where we can think more carefully as clinicians about the specific circumstances and needs of individuals and families. But on the other hand, there is this necessity and this utility to accomplish some kind of meaningful explanation, some kind of clinical resolution to these problems. And so sometimes emotion can be closed down, contained, traversed in an effort to kind of reach that, to accomplish those kinds of diagnoses. So it's a kind of an interesting field to kind of understand better, I suppose, and to think about, particularly in the context of some of the things that Richard was talking about trying to increase specificity and certainty, about what do we lose in terms of the utility of ambivalence and uncertainty when we look at the clinical setting. So, I can't move on. the paper that Julia referred to at the beginning is there if anybody's interested, and there's just a list of some of the other sources we've made reference to. But finally, thank you so much for inviting us to do this, because this has been great for me. It's been brilliant to get Richard and Julia back in and to talk about some of these things and trying to think about how to move them forward. And so we'd really be interested in any suggestions, questions, insight. But a few of the things that I thought might be interesting is one of the things Julia and I have discussed a lot is this relationship between uncertainty and affect and emotion, and if this is something that's very specific to Alzheimer's or if it could translate to other kind of uncertain conditions. So we're really interested to hear what other people might think about that, but also where we are now in terms of that, the kind of research context, which seems increasingly disconnected perhaps to the clinical context, which is still very much working through all of that ambiguity and uncertainty. And the role that aging plays very much in that across all of the different parts of thinking about early detection and diagnosis in dementia, and how that is also associated with some of those emotional responses about how we think about what a good old age looks like, dementia fits in that. So yeah, thank you so much, and yeah, really looking forward to getting some questions and responses.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Julia. Julia, if you could remove the slides so we can see our faces a little bit more. Thank you. This was really fascinating, and there's so many things that we could touch upon and so many questions, particularly the how different settings like the house, like the clinic, create kind of different ways of negotiating uncertainty and negotiating anticipation, and also the role of awareness. Like, when do you become aware of a potential thing happening to you? How do you become aware? How all these possibilities of technology, to what extent they consider that awareness will create other loops, in a way, other potential reactions. I remember a while ago there was a proposal by Facebook to detect mental illness through the usage of Facebook, and one of the measures was like people not using Facebook as much as before. That could be a potential red flag. And it was like, okay, like it might make sense, but we need to look at how technologies actually promote the use of kind of commercial interests in promoting this potential for assessment. And but I just want to share those thoughts, and I want to invite everyone, in also the speakers, to ask questions to each other. You can use the chat, you can use the hand function and raise your voice. So you're all invited.
Well, if I'm allowed, I might
Go ahead.
I might jump in and ask Richard a question about the new technologies of monitoring, because years ago I was involved in a project that was like jointly funded by the MRC and EPSRC that was looking at new technologies to monitor early detection and deteriorations in chronic conditions. So it was like, it wasn't Alzheimer's and dementia, but it was things like COPD or heart failure and things. So it was like wearable devices. But it got me thinking, because I think the thing that you're describing is that there's this separation, in a sense, between the healthcare setting and the kind of commercial setting, because as soon as you start to generate health data, you immediately have questions about who owns that data, who's responsible to respond to it, who's liable if something's missed, and so I guess that there's that separation there to try and avoid that in the commercial setting. But in a sense, that sort of hides a lot of those regulatory, accountability, ethical issues, because they're still there. Even if there's not a nurse at the end who's supposed to be monitoring this data. Do you see what I mean? So I was just wondering what's come out in terms of those interviews about how they see that separation, why it's there, or what the purpose of it is. That's a very rambling question, sorry.
No, it's a good question. I mean, yeah, and thanks. It was also, yeah, because I've read your paper, but it was not really nice to see it kind of presented, and so thank you. I really enjoyed that. I mean, in terms of the interviews that we did, I think where there were kind of 2 points at which these kind of conversations really opened up. I think one was around the kind of regulatory question, and the kind of challenges of achieving medical device regulation, and the kind of boundaries of what you can and can't do if you're on a medical device, but equally the limitations of, you know, the more you kind of push into that medical device space, the more onerous it becomes. And then and so then the kind of skirting around, like, what can you do before you get into kind of too deep water, which I think is interesting. And then the other kind of context was about, I mean, when people, kind of one of the core promises in a way of digital health tools is that ability to give people information back on, like, kind of, you know, the idea that people use it to kind of benchmark themselves against populations. You know, I do this amount of exercise, my heart rate's that, and this is the kind of range. But on the kind of cognition thing, so we had a couple of companies who talked about the kind of, well, one company who talked about how they had started giving people back information within a clinical trial context, and they'd realized very quickly that this was something that was really kind of really bothering people, and that there was a kind of division within the company between the kind of technical, let's give this information back, and the kind of ethics and governance team, who were kind of like, this is not, yeah, this is not working. And so there's a kind of change of a fairly rapid change of practice, but also just that kind of point at which people bump up against that question, which I think for some anyway is now being answered by the clinical trials. That, you know, this idea that, you know, why do you give this information back when there's no treatment? And that's that kind of constant kind of thing that felt like a kind of, well, you know, so we talked to people about, you know, who were, well, it's a really interesting space to innovate. There's this really kind of there's this real public health need. There's this technology that can do this, and so we're going to build this tool that can kind of drive early detection. And then what do we do with it? It's the kind of there's always this kind of promissory thing of, like, you know, the articles, the websites, the papers are always, well, you know, in the near future we will be able to we will have a treatment, and that, yeah, may or may not be getting closer, but it's still, yeah, that so those are the kind of, I think, the two moments, the kind of one around, yeah, actionability, returning information to people, and the other about, yeah, the kind of regulatory space.
Yeah, because sorry, if I'm hogging I'll shut up in a minute, but because I'm wondering, because you're right. I mean, even the new treatments are still based on a kind of a fairly minimal effect on the rate of decline, but I'm wondering whether part of the push towards this sort of screening or tools is now based much more around lifestyle change. So there's the Lancet paper, the Livingston paper, which is all about, you know, the 7 things you can do. Is it 7 or has it gone up again? You know, to reduce your risk of dementia, the kind of population studies showing modifiable risks, and whether that is increasingly sitting in place of the sort of lack of major success in terms of drug treatments or other kinds of clinical interventions. But yeah, I don't know.
Alex, can I comment?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, thank you for all the information. But just John Nolan here from Ireland, from the Nutrition Research Centre. We do a lot of work with lifestyle and nutrition, and, you know, with all the wonderful technologies that have become available, and we welcome them in terms of early detection. I enjoyed the conversation about the anxiety that creates, because being told that there's something to deal with, and then the conclusion is, well, we have no treatment. I really hope that as a community, we can embrace that data, because what happens, unfortunately, is because it's not sensationalized to the point of a treatment, it doesn't get the attention that we clearly know it can give. And it can be general, it can be lifestyle, as you say, it can be community, it can be friends, it can be, you know, using your brain, but also we now have access to nutrition related information that are micronutrients that are present and working throughout our body, and our brains and our retinas being no different. And the problem I see as a scientist that has been very lucky to work in this space is no matter what we do in our own studies, no matter what we demonstrate, it's beaten down straight away. As you know, we're told it's not a big enough study, you know, yada, yada, yada. We'll never get to do a big enough study with the access to budget that we have to do these lifestyle and nutrition, targeted nutrition works. And I welcome and congratulations to running this event, because I hope that this community can build upon what you just said, Alex, and that is the role of, and again, to sober how that can be successful. We've seen in our own trials, patients having great success with particularly carotenoids and omega-3 fatty acids combined and so on. But we know that that's not the silver bullet. And I think a solution or a method for Alzheimer's disease will never be a silver bullet. It can't be. So we have to stop looking for something that doesn't exist, but we have to accept that we're living longer. We have to accept that nutritional profiles and patterns are changing. We have to accept that our children don't have access to the foods that they should have. Even in the wonderful countries we live in. So yeah, I just want to kind of thank you for the opportunity to make that point, because I think if I'm told something, I have to deal with something. I want to know, to Richard's point, well, what are we going to do about it? But it shouldn't be, let's wait till we have something that's so severe and so sick that we have to have a pharmaceutical to fix it. The fixing of this is Health 3.0, and that's stuff we all know about as scientists. And so I hope we can embrace that. I look forward to continuing our work here at the NRCI to try and do that. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for that point, because one of the things I've been reading a bit more about actually is that idea of kind of how people build up resilience, because there are lots of people who have those biomarkers of Alzheimer's disease, for example, who don't necessarily develop dementing symptoms. And so there's increasing work trying to understand why that is, what protects them from the effects of those markers. And there are as you say, there are lots of things that suggest even things like maintaining forms of social interaction can be a protective factor, and trying to understand things like that better, that the kind of social and physical environment and how that relates to our cognition as we age. I think there's really fascinating things coming along, but you're right in that the focus in the science world does tend to very much be in one direction. But yeah, fascinating.
So I just want to ask if there's any other questions, comments also in the chat. In the meantime, maybe I can contribute with a question, comment for Richard. I was thinking a lot about the potential of technology as you mentioned it, and the potential of like looking at how people interact with objects that are smart in a way. And of course, it's easy to see the seduction that creates as a replacement for slow, expensive, kind of formal ways of assessing and evaluating and asking people to make tests when they are all like everybody's making tests all day through the use of social media. But at the same time, like to come back to something that I mentioned at the end, like I don't know if there is also awareness or research looking at the kind of the incentives or the interests that technology companies could have in framing the use of technology as something that could help you be healthier, which is something that companies are doing all the time through, I don't know, watches and measuring. Is that negative potential also part of the discussion or not?
So the negative potential for kind of so
maybe negative is not the right word, but the fact that increasing the use of technology is convenient, of course, for commercial interests, and to what extent framing the use of technology as something that could replace traditional assessment or is also convenient for technology and could create a lot of problems too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I mean, in part, I think you can see, so you can see that kind of clear commercial potential of this type of information from the way that it's been. I mean, so things like the kind of atrial fibrillation detection in the kind of Apple Watch, and this kind of this ability to refer people on, and there are then cases of anxiety induced by the use of the Apple Watch, where you have people kind of taking their pulse kind of thousands of times a day in order to kind of keep an eye. And I think that then you see that in the kind of the move of the same companies into brain health. So I think there's a so there is a question about kind of motives and the alignment of, like, to what extent is the public health motive aligned with the kind of commercial motive, and also I think and then I think the kind of question of, do we have in place, I think the kind of the open-endedness. So for example, with the Google example that I showed, or the other ones, they're kind of like there's a kind of, well, we'll detect and we'll refer on, and it's like, well, you refer on where, like, to who, why, what to people, what happens with that information. And I think that's the kind of tension that potentially, as we, there is a drive to increase the adoption of tech here, there, and everywhere, and the kind of how you bring the conversation about what you do with that information into introduction of as part of the kind of the decision making about is an open question. I think that's a rambling answer. Sorry. I just wanted to pick up, sorry, Alex, on the kind of point that you made at the end about uncertainty in other areas, and actually then connect maybe Julia, because I know you've kind of moved on to work on other areas, and I was kind of interested in how that patterning of uncertainty has, like, how you've, is it something that kind of translates?
Yeah, I think Alex and I have spoken about this since I work in cancer now rather than Alzheimer's, but similarly looking at kind of the promise of new technologies such as immunotherapies in cancer, as well as genomic medicine. And what's really interesting is that there are so many parallels in terms of the kind of uncertainties around, cancer is seen to be a fixed condition in terms of its etiology, and yet it's always on the move over time. It's always changing. Understanding about the kind of sub-cancers, or how they are categorized or reclassified in relation to mutations. So cancer is, seen to be fixed, but in the same way to Alzheimer's, you can't pin it, in lots of ways, you can't pin it down in terms of how treatment's organized, or so in that sense, etiologically, there are parallels in terms of uncertainties, but I think Alex and I had a quick chat about this yesterday. I think that's what's really interesting about Alzheimer's, is exactly this kind of pervasive loss of self that still exists. So talking to cancer patients in my own research now, and in talking to them about genomic medicine and kind of their experiences of living with cancer, so many patients said, I'm glad I'm not living with dementia. I'm glad it's not dementia. And there was always that, and I think there was that comparison in one of the quotes that you had, Alex, in the presentation. And I think it is the temporality element of Alzheimer's is, I think, what's key. That kind of the imagined figure of Alzheimer's will happen somewhere in the future down the line. That loss of me, that loss of self really sticks. So I think that's what's interesting and unique to Alzheimer's. But in lots of ways, lots of uncertainties around etiology, the way that you can't kind of pin down Alzheimer's, you can't pin down cancer in lots of ways. There are lots of parallels that are there, but yeah, that loss of self, I think, with Alzheimer's is what pervades, yeah, makes it unique in lots of ways. But yes, that gets at some of your question, I think, should.
I think picking up on that as well, one of the things I've been trying to develop further is this idea of that specific thing around temporality and those fears. And that plays out for people at all stages of the condition, and how there's this constant moving category of like I think there was a paper I read where they called it the not yet horizon. So, you know, the fear of, you know, when I can't do things for myself, or when I can't recognize my loved ones, or when I can't be mobile, but it's always pushed to a state in the future quite often. It's like the kind of that figure of the feared, that imaginary of what living with Alzheimer's or dementia looks like, which is just so sort of entrenched, I think, culturally, but that it's often pushed back to this point in the future. It's something I'm trying to sort of, and that's not just for people in the early stages, but even in sort of moderate stages of their condition, and family members who describe this point in the future that they're constantly trying to avoid, which I think is quite unique to Alzheimer's.
Oh,
Please, Richard.
no, sorry, I've got a question in the chat which I thought had gone to everybody, but I think it's just come to me. But it was about, I don't know whether it's a kind of question about the development of brain health services and their potential role in screening. Can
you share the question? And
yeah, let me put it in.
It was actually a question I had for you as well, Richard, whether you'd engage with brain health services at all as part of your work, or. Yeah.
I mean, kind of recently, a bit, but it's yeah, because but I think one of the things that's kind of really interesting. So brain health services being these kind of things that are in a sense that kind of intermediate body between kind of primary care and kind of the memory clinic, and or that incorporate elements of memory clinic and elements of population health. But I think, I mean, one of the things interesting about them is that they are very different in different countries. I know within Europe, there's kind of there are multiple forms of the brain health service coming together, and I think one of the kind of I think it's a really interesting kind of empirical question about the ways in which brain health is formulated in those different settings. I think one of the striking things about that is that you've got a kind of triangulation upon this point of early detection from various different angles, and I think so. One of them being the commercial aspect, and another being the extension, kind of, I suppose, backwards through the disease trajectory of the memory clinic, of kind of secondary care services that are kind of coming to become more involved in population health activities, rather than necessarily coming out of public health. And I think that's just the kind of interesting, it's a kind of power dynamic, but it's an interesting kind of like whose responsibility is it within a health system for these kinds of activities, and who has the resources to do them, and then what does that mean for how we end up defining and treating some of these things.
okay, well, I think we are getting to the end of the presentations and the discussion. It was a pleasure to host the 3 presentations. I think there's so much to discuss around this, and I hope that people that participated could get in touch if they have more questions and if they have ideas. You can reach us through the Wellcome Center emails, and we will see you all again next month for another seminar. So thanks, Alex. Thanks, Richard. Thanks, Julia. Thanks, Lou, also for organizing this.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much. Nice to see you both.
Bye.
Bye.